We are now going to get into the leg lock specific concepts. We wrapped up our overall joint lock concepts with the primary and secondary, which is kind of like, how are we going to how are we going to lock somebody in while we damage them, which is like the marriage. And now we're going to get into how do we convince them to do threesomes. So we're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about the ingredients that we need for any good leg lock, which is control of the hip, control of the knee, and control of the end of the lever that we are attacking. So again, we're usually going to use this, 411 saddle as an example. So any good leg lock is going to require you to fulfill these three requirements. And it doesn't have to be direct. So like right now, I'm controlling Stephan's hip with a wedge. I've got good wedges around, I've got a pinning force at Stephan's hip where it's going to be difficult for him to lift it off the ground. I've got a strong wedge behind his knee, so it's difficult for him to extract his knee. And now I'm accessing the end of the lever. In this case, it's going to be his foot, so that I can use that lever to rotate his tibia so that I can create some damage. I could achieve similar effects like this. I'm stepping on Stephan's hip. This is creating a pinning force against his hip. My hip and thigh behind his knee is creating a wedge. Even though my knees are open, I no longer have to squeeze so much just because the counter tension stretching his calf across my hip. Like if you wanted to pull your leg out, you wouldn't do it. The wedges are strong enough. So wedges doesn't always mean squeezing your knees super tight, although sometimes it does. So again, in this case, I've got control of Stephan's hip. I've got control of a pinning force at his hip. I've got control with a wedge at his knee, and I've got control of the end of the lever. How I achieve it, and we'll talk about this in more detail a little bit later on. I either get to the hip first and work to the end of the lever as a control format, or I get to the end of the lever first and I move myself in to the hip afterwards. But if I don't achieve all three of those things, again, it's not never. These are, as much as these are concepts that you want to go by, there are going to be occasional exceptions or ways that, like, for instance, I can control your hip if I'm doing a good enough job of controlling your femur, even though I'm not directly pushing on your hip. In the example of, I can do this on this side, in the example of the Kyotera ankle lock, which we're not going to be discussing in this volume because we covered it extensively in the first one and there's plenty of material out there. Right now, I don't have any specific direct force on your hip, but can you lift your hip off the ground?
Not really.
No, because I've got enough of a wedge around your knee that creates enough of a lever effect. I'm essentially using your femur as a lever against your hip, keeping your hip isolated. I could apply additional force here, which might work, might not work. I might be vulnerable to a leg drag. That doesn't really matter, but I can do it directly or I can do it indirectly via the use of this lever. So when we say that you need to control the hip, that doesn't mean that some part of your body needs to be touching someone's hip. It just means that ideally, if I want to create damage, I need to have some method of controlling this, some method of controlling this, and some method of pulling on this or twisting this, and I'm going to be effective. If I'm missing one of those things, the odds that somebody escapes go up dramatically, and in some cases are pretty much guaranteed. So those are the three things that you need to do to get a good leg lock going.